talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say.
Hi, welcome along to NUFC Matters. This is the Transfer Show with Ben Jacobs and myself, Steve Wraith. How are you, Ben?
Very well. The season is over, but the window is upon us, so it's non-stop.
It is non-stop, and it's been non-stop for you. I see you're sporting a Champions League shirt there, mate. You were in Istanbul. Tell us about that and what the occasion was like.
Yeah, well, CBS covered the Champions League final, so our team was on the ground with the likes of Micah Richards and Thierry Henry, and it was a very interesting final because Inter played their part in kind of stifling Manchester City. Romelu Lukaku missed a big chance, but Manchester City are the winners of the treble. And I think that with Champions League finals, they're always a little bit different, especially when they're in this part of the world. And by this part of the world, I just mean a sticky hot climate, but also perhaps as importantly, a late kickoff as well. And I know that players kind of try to stay on UK time, but I always think it's a little bit different when you have a UK kickoff time of 8 p.m, but it was 10 o'clock local time. And as a result, it is a slightly different routine. And sometimes that can knock teams out of sync. And then when I saw the Manchester City lineup, I felt like Kyle Walker might be a big miss. He was only on the bench, and Manchester City didn't play particularly well in the first half, but they found a goal. And I think we all expected them to score and didn't take their chances. Manchester City did. They won a tight game, and no one will remember whether it was a little bit ugly or not. They will only look at the treble going down in history, and that is just football. And this is what Pep Guardiola said in the build-up, didn't he? That Manchester City have to win the Champions League to become a truly great team, and I think that's what they are now. So for the likes of Newcastle and Arsenal in particular as well, who pushed them closest last season, they've got to find a way somehow over this summer transfer window to either, with what they've got or with what they buy, close the gap a little bit. And it's a big, big task because there's nothing to suggest that the Manchester City dominance is going to end anytime soon.
Only the second manager to achieve the treble in the Premier League. And Alex Ferguson, of course, texted Pep Guardiola to congratulate him. Does this set out, the plan forward now for Pep? Will he be looking to regain that title, as quickly as possible? I mean, it's got to be hard in one way to motivate yourself once you've won everything. He's achieved what he set out to do.
Yeah, absolutely right. And winning a treble in back-to-back seasons would be astonishing. So there's an aim there. Winning the quadruple is another one as well. I think Pep Guardiola will be motivated as soon as the new season starts, because what Manchester City are looking for is dominance. And I think domestically they've already got it, but Liverpool have ran them close in previous seasons, and Arsenal as well look nailed on at points during the season to either win the title or be firm favourites. So I think Manchester City will have a few aims in mind. One is just repeating what they've done. Two is still that quadruple, which would be incredible. But for Pep Guardiola personally, it is about backing it up, I think. And he's got nothing to prove as a manager. But by the way, he didn't have anything to prove as a manager before he won the Champions League with Manchester City either. So this for me is about trying to create an era. And we don't really know when Pep Guardiola is thinking about his next challenge, but he won't be at Manchester City forever, even if glory continues, because as you say, there's only so many times you can do the same thing over and over and over again. And that was part of the reason why I think he left Bayern Munich, even though he wasn't able to win the Champions League there. There was a monotony, for want of a better word, to the success, which sounds ridiculous because what fan of Bayern or PSG or some of the other clubs that regularly win titles, what fans are bored of that? And in the Premier League, every single time you win a title, whether it's a league title or, of course, cup competition, it's always tough because the level of competition is so much higher. So if Manchester City can get 100 points, score 100 goals, complete a quadruple, win the Champions League in back-to-back seasons, I think all of these things are still motivations. So I don't think that Pep will feel stale about the situation at Manchester City, but he's got a sort of critic-based chip off his shoulder, a sort of imposed, because he's fueled it a little bit, narrative around Pep as a Champions League failure prior to achieving this. And Pep's been quite happy to embrace it, to laugh it off, to question it at times. But then suddenly he did get all serious before the final after they won the FA Cup. And he said, we have to win this to go down in history. We have to admit that if we don't win the Champions League, then in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, however long, this will be forgotten. And that's like the oddity of football, isn't it? That if we're really superficial, what do people remember in football? And I mean really, really superficial, because Newcastle fans will always remember the Champions League qualification. Everyone will have their own club memories. But if you talk about the neutral fan and you jump forwards in time, what are people going to remember? Well, it's Manchester United won the treble in 1999. Do they remember much else about Manchester United? Arsenal were the Invincibles. Do they remember much else about Arsenal? Leicester won the Premier League. Do they remember much else about Leicester? So there's not actually that many things that linger. Brian Clough and Nottingham Forest. There's probably only 10, 15 moments in football that to the neutral linger 20 years on, 50 years on. And I think this is why it's important for Manchester City to have completed this treble, because it simply won't be forgotten in the same way that Manchester United's treble in 1999 hasn't been either.
Okay, let's move on to the transfer window. Young Kuba has signed for Newcastle United. The paperwork will, of course, be the I's will be dotted, the T's will be crossed on the 1st of July. Newcastle already confirmed that he will be loaned out on a season-long loan to Feyenoord, and a picture already released of Minte in his Feyenoord strip. But he's a forward. He made 17 senior appearances for OB in the Danish Superliga, scored 4 goals and registered 6 assists. Dan Ashworth was quoted as saying that we are very pleased to be bringing a player with young Kuba's high potential to Newcastle United. And the fee is believed to be around the £7 million mark. So Newcastle acting early and, as we expected, concentrating not only on bringing experienced players in who will be useful for a big Premier League season to come and the Champions League campaign, but also still heavily investing in youth, Ben.
Yeah, and a very smart signing. As you say, he'll officially join on the 1st of July, and then he'll go off to Feyenoord in 2023, 2024. And this is good because Newcastle haven't just got a signing, but a plan and a pathway for that signing as well, which I think is really important too, because players don't want to join a big club like Newcastle, even with Champions League football, unless they feel that they've got a short-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term plan. And Young Kuba is a Gambian winger, fast, intelligent, loves to cut inside, little bit of work to be done off the ball, and a fair amount of decision-making development still. I've watched a fair amount from him over the course of the last 16 to 18 months. And he reminds me a little bit actually of Damari Gray when he was at my side, Leicester, compared to Everton. And when Gray was at Leicester, there was huge potential and pace, but very consistently he'd get into threatening positions and he'd spend all of his time and energy thinking about where to go and where to run and how to touch and control the ball, which is normal from a young player. And then he'd get there and the head would be down and there wasn't perhaps that awareness to look up or use the peripheral vision. So that's an area of improvement. But for an 18-year-old, he's a relatively complete package at this stage. He scored 4 goals and 6 assists in only 7 Superliga matches last season. So you can understand why Newcastle think that he's got a big potential. And the fee is not reckless by any stretch of the imagination, but anything pushing 10 million for a player that's still a teenager is a lot of money. And it shows you that Newcastle have a huge amount of faith in the player. So there's a big promising career ahead. And the other thing to point out is that he's also won a couple of caps for Gambia in friendlies as well. So there's that international pedigree too. So I think that this is a really good long-term prospect for Newcastle. And then we wait and see whether, in addition to focusing on youth, which is a big part of the project, and Dan Ashworth's put a lot of time and energy into that, Newcastle can do 2 other things. One is add any what would be considered near automatic starters. And then the other thing is, of course, depth, because they're playing Champions League football next season.
Yeah. Okay. Good signing. Good start. I did send you a list, which I'm sure you have browsed at your perusal, maybe on a flight back from the Champions League. A few names that were familiar on this list that Barry Hogan is kindly putting together for us each week of transfer speculation from different sources around the world. And we've agreed to pick out a few names which maybe you've still got an opportunity of moving to Newcastle. We're going to start with James Madison because he's been probably the most heavily linked player, with Newcastle since the takeover went through, and lots of noise coming out of various newspapers this week that Newcastle now are at the front of the line, to potentially persuade James Madison to come to Newcastle. He's not so keen on going to Tottenham now that they've got the new manager established, and if Newcastle can come up with a suitable deal with Leicester and agree to personal terms with James Madison, all being well, he might be in black and white just after the 1st of July if Newcastle get their man.
Yeah, I think that Newcastle need to act quick. I've probably said this 100 times, so like a broken record. It's one of those where you get to the point where the transfer now might happen and you get a lot of media reporting, but none of it's particularly different to what we were talking about in January when I broke the story that Newcastle were interested, and also so were Spurs, and it's still Newcastle and Spurs as well. I think the Manchester United links that you may see don't have too much substance to them, but it'll be very interesting to see whether they're quite happy to at least explore the terms on that, because remember, you might chase a player in order to get a valuation, and Manchester United want Mason Mount and Chelsea are asking for 70 to 75 million. So if Madison's available at 40 million, you've got a bit of a yardstick and you've got another option. So I think it's understandable that there will be links between Manchester United and James Madison, but it's looking like Newcastle and Tottenham are the two primary contenders at this point. There's lots of other clubs that obviously are aware that Madison is going to be available at relative value in the market. And I expect Newcastle to move quick, but also on top of that, I genuinely believe that they'll stick to their valuation from a year ago. So they'll be looking at a deal for 40 million rather than anything close to 60 million. And a year on, and with Leicester relegated, it's normal in many ways that the price for Madison isn't going to be any higher. So because Newcastle have already put that 40 to 45 million on the table, we have to wait and see now how much they're prepared to pay guaranteed to get to a total package that's acceptable to Leicester. It wouldn't surprise me if starting bids are actually more like 35 million, because if Newcastle bid 40, 45 million a year ago, why are they only going to match that? You might come in a little bit lower, but they definitely don't want to back and forth because it's a different Leicester now. Leicester are willing to sell James Madison, whereas a year ago they simply weren't. Brendan Rodgers laughed off the Newcastle offer. It was rejected very quickly. And at that point, Madison wanted to know what he was in for. And this is another factor in everything. Madison was waiting until the end of the season because whether Leicester stayed up or went down, he wanted to know with both Newcastle and Spurs what was on offer. So the advantage for Newcastle now is that not only does he hear great things about the football club, but Tottenham ultimately don't have any European football and Newcastle have got Champions League football. So to go to Spurs, it would be more, I think, about his personal situation, more about London, more about the long term, whereas Newcastle can offer something for the now. I still think that also Spurs would offer slightly higher wages, but maybe not too much difference between the two packages. So this one has legs to it. It's had legs to it for 6 months. It's exactly the kind of position and exactly the kind of player that Eddie Howe is interested in as a reasonably high priority. And to be honest with you, if Newcastle got James Madison for around 40 million or under, it would be a fantastic bit of business. The last thing I'd say in terms of speed is just be aware of one thing. Footballers are humans as well. And I say that because James Madison's on his holidays at the moment in Spain, and it's actually a baby moon. And him and his girlfriend, Kennedy Alexa, are expecting not just a baby, but twins in just a matter of weeks. So that's going to be a factor in all of this as well, in terms of Madison prioritizing family, thinking also about what's right for his family, and making sure that I think there's a settled element to all of this. So priority, of course, is the birth, but after the birth, the last thing I think he'll want to do with two newborns is kind of not know early where he's going to go, because they might have to move houses. It might affect in some way the early stages of the babies and how they settle. So I think this will be a bigger consideration than you think for Madison, because he's not an 18-year-old that can just pick up everything and run. He's got to think about a family and a growing family and 2 new children. So I expect him to come back from Spain. Obviously, the birth will happen. And then I think that Madison, by the time we get to, at the latest, I would say, and it might even happen before, the early part of July, will want to know exactly where he's going.
Yuri Tielemans was linked with Newcastle, but his chosen club of choice and the one that stumped up the wages for the man was Aston Villa. So that one comes off Barry's list. But another name that's been quite common in dispatches for Newcastle United in the last few weeks is Dominic Sabrosa. It's only taken us about 3 weeks to get his name right, but we're there now. What's the strength in this one? What are you hearing at the moment about Dominic?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this a few weeks back, and one aspect in all of this is still going to be price. But make no mistake, this is the kind of player that could take very quickly to the Premier League. And I think that what Newcastle have done well with a number of targets, and I hold my hands up because I didn't think that Botman would settle as quickly. I didn't think that Bruno would even take as quickly to the Premier League. And what Newcastle have done really well is not just made a bunch of quality signings over the course of the last few windows, but they've somehow found a way of understanding how to get these signings going quickly. I can't think of many big Newcastle signings that haven't taken quickly to Premier League football. I suppose you could say Alexander Isak in the first half of the season, but then when he got fit and playing regularly, took to the Premier League in his first season. He was vital in the back half of the season. Bruno Guimaraes, another example. Sven Botman, another example. Okay, with other players that have had Premier League experience or are more established, like Kieran Trippier, Nick Pope, perhaps it was more expected. But I've been really impressed with how Newcastle's recruitment team have not just got a target and at value, but found a way to actually have them bed into the Premier League effectively in their first season and contribute. And that's not, by the way, just about Howe and his coaching and the culture of the football club. That's about the recruitment team being positive, that it is the right signing and they're not taking as much risk. So all credit really to everybody at Newcastle United. And I think Szoboszlai is another example of that. And at only 22, he's the captain of the Hungarian national team, which tells you that there's a leader as well. And I think that there's some substance to this one for sure. I know that Arsenal have looked in the past as well. But again, it's all going to come down to fee. So I wouldn't want to get carried away at this point. I think that it's going to take a minimum of 60 million to get a deal done with Leipzig. And Newcastle are not going to necessarily be reckless in how they do their business over the course of the summer, even with Champions League football. So there's a release clause in all of this as well, which is set at 70 million euros. That's about 61 million quid. And Newcastle, I don't think, would be triggering that. They'd be trying to get a different kind of deal. So I'm not aware of anything advanced at this point, but absolutely, there's been internal discussions and scouting over the player. And that's because he's got a good first touch. He's young. He's the right profile. He gets box to box. And the stats from this season reflect all of those aspects. I think that it's 6 goals scored for Leipzig in the league, 10 in all competitions, chipped in with assists as well. And the numbers are also very consistent between 2021-22 and 2022-23. And then when you add a few international goals and the leadership qualities as well, it would be very smart of Newcastle to move in this direction. But, let's say they get Madison, a creative-minded midfielder, then I think the next priority will be to put the budget on another position first, rather than dropping 60, 70 million on this kind of profile. So I think Szoboszlai is an option. I know there's a few Premier League clubs and European teams that are looking. Napoli are one to watch, as, by the way, Jose Mourinho's Roma, who have taken a look in the past. And then my understanding is that in Germany, Dortmund are relatively keen. Keep an eye as well. They're a bit of a dark horse because they've not moved yet on West Ham United too, who could have some money to spend and most likely when the Declan Rice saga ends. And it looks like, of course, he's going to Arsenal, has been vaguely linked with Newcastle in the past as well. But we can check that one off. Rice, as long as Arsenal agree a fee with West Ham, will move to Arsenal. And I think Newcastle have known that. Manchester United have known that. Bayern have known that. So first of all, we have to see what Arsenal offer. They're preparing the formal offer at the time of recording. But if West Ham are satisfied with that offer in the process of negotiation, then there's a real feeling in the industry that Rice is only going to end up in one place, and that's Arsenal.
Yeah, it's going to be a big summer ahead, and it always takes one big one to move, and then, there's usually a domino effect. So I think Madison and Rice, maybe he's moving in the first few weeks of the transfer window, might just do that. Okay, another name that's been linked quite heavily with Newcastle at the moment, and tenuous links because, of course, Kieran Trippier played with the player, is João Felix.
Yeah, João Felix is an interesting one. What I'd say is that Newcastle's number one priority is not to do anything reckless because of Champions League that goes against their model and long-term planning. And I know that sounds really pessimistic because everyone's excited about the Champions League. But the reason why I mention it is because João Felix comes with big wages, big fee, or if you loan him, still very high costs. And when he was available for loan mid-season and Chelsea moved, you may note that both Manchester United and Arsenal were put off by the package. And my understanding is it's very similar with Newcastle United as well. So Atleti do want to offload, but before he moved to Chelsea on loan, they were able to persuade Felix to extend by a year until 2027. So the value of the player has been fully protected. So permanent sale, even at a cut price deal, I would say 80 million euros, about 70 million quid. And again, that's a big outlay for from Newcastle's point of view, I would say it all depends on if they get Madison or anyone else, but quite a luxury player because he's not a traditional number 9. And does he fit into Eddie Howe's system, especially if Madison arrives? You've got a lot of players behind that front three that like to break forwards. And João Felix is effectively a playmaker and loves to be in central areas and link things up. So for me, it's only my personal opinion, I don't see him fitting into Newcastle's system or philosophy. But they've got the Champions League football, so the fact that they can even be in the conversation for a player like that shows you how far the club have come. There's certainly an admiration for his potential and profile, but again, it all just comes down to numbers. And the last thing Newcastle want to do is bring in a bunch of players on sky-high wages and sky-high fees and then find that in a season's time, not only is there not a fit, but they don't have Champions League football again. And hopefully it won't happen. And then you're saddled with that and your entire wage structure and your entire model goes out of the window. So I actually, and again, I'm only giving you my personal opinion here because I'm not denying that there is a due diligence taking place or that there may be some interest in the player. But for me, if Newcastle were to sign João Felix, then it would be the first time under this new ownership that we've seen an alarm bell ring, because it tells you that they're changing their philosophy and they're paying over the odds, because Atleti are giving no one a cut price deal and they're paying over the wages they want to pay. So you've got to be sure, therefore, that João Felix is the solution. And unfortunately, when you look at Chelsea, for all of the intrepidness, for all of the intelligence, he couldn't finish. And you're not paying that money for João Felix unless you're getting an end product as well. So maybe Newcastle see something I don't, and maybe they feel that Eddie Howe is the man to help João Felix rediscover his goal-scoring touch. But of all the names that we've mentioned, it's only my personal opinion again, this one makes the least sense.
Okay, we are halfway through the show. Time for the ads.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces, which are handmade in Cumbria. Their website is mrvickies.co.uk. If you want to contact the guys, email info@mrvickies.co.uk or telephone 01768 210 102. Big thanks to New Workwear. They are an agile and dedicated workwear provider launched in 2018. For more information, go to their website, newworkwear.com. Big thanks, as always, to Media Arts for the help with the video side of things. If you want to support the channel, hit the subscribe button, become a subscriber today. Hit the thumb up under the video, which likes the video, and click share to share to your other social media. Click join if you want to become a member of the channel for as little as $1.99, or take a one-off payment for the cult membership. You can get in via this QR code if you've got a smartphone, or look for membership pack on the website, NUFCmatters.com. What do you get for your one-off £25 payment? You get a scarf, a pen, and a cup, and a membership card, and entry into the monthly draw. Don't forget, if you want a car sticker, all you need to do is subscribe to the show and then email John at NUFC Matters, and he will post you a free car sticker out. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. And we also support the food bank on this channel. NUFCfansfoodbank.co.uk is the virtual matchday bucket where you can make a virtual donation 365 days of the year. The new Alan Shearer raffle is underway. 150 tickets at £1 a ticket. You could win a limited edition signed Alan Shearer ball from the 260 dinner. Enter now at NUFCmatters.com. We've got a few events coming up. August the 5th sees Gavin Peacock at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets are £10, and you can get them now from NUFCmatters.com. Our Christmas event takes place on the 7th of December at the Tyneside Irish Centre, and that's an evening with Frank Clark. Tickets are £15 and available from NUFCmatters.com. Finally, Waddle, Keegan, Beardsley and Friends, the class of 84, is on at the Tyne Theatre and Opera House on Westgate Road in Newcastle on Thursday, January the 23rd. Tickets are now available from the Tyne Theatre and Opera House.co.uk or telephone 0844 2491 000. That's the box office telephone number 0844 2491 000.
Okay, are you back with a transfer show on NUFC Matters? Another player constantly linked with Newcastle. Pre-transfer window opening has been Kieran Tierney from Arsenal. Any more on this one, Ben?
Not a great deal more at this stage. This was a story that I actually broke a few months back, that Newcastle had an interest. And I think what we can say is that a starting left back is a very realistic possibility. Earlier in the show, we were talking about how there's these two kinds of players, if we're discounting the ones for the future, which is the third category. One is depth. One is someone to drop into the starting 11. And I do think that Newcastle could sign a starting 11 left back, and Kieran Tierney would be somebody that's potentially available. It's all going to come down to the player, though. That's the main thing to stress in this, because since Alexander Zinchenko joined Arsenal, Tierney's fallen down the pecking order, but Mikel Arteta really rates him. So I wouldn't exactly say that Arsenal want to sell Tierney. It's more for the player to decide if he gets an offer that gives him a starting spot at left back, and in Newcastle's case, Champions League football as well. Is that enough for him to then tell Arsenal that he wants to leave? We're also, by the way, hearing some numbers that I think are low in terms of estimations. I've seen reports saying 20, 25 million. I think it would be closer to 35 million and maybe even a little bit more. So Tierney to Newcastle is possible. No approach has been made at this point, but he's on the list in terms of players that they've scouted and discussed internally. But the first thing to understand is whether the player does or doesn't want to leave.
Another Leicester player in the in the spotlight, I guess, is Harvey Barnes, and Newcastle in the running, according to some newspapers, for his signature. He's again quite heavily linked in with the transfer at Newcastle the last couple of weeks. What's your take on Harvey Barnes? Where do you think he will end up?
I think that Newcastle really liked Harvey Barnes a year ago. By the way, he's had an absolutely sensational season, even though Leicester have gone down. So you can understand why clubs are circling. And even if Leicester had stayed up, I think that would have been the case. But it'd be unthinkable. And Leicester would love it, of course. But it would be a massive surprise if Harvey Barnes was still at Leicester come the first game of the season in the Championship. for the Foxes, 13 goals in the Premier League in 34 games, and that's over double what he scored last season, and far more consistent with the Harvey Barnes that we saw 2 seasons ago in 2020, 2021, when he scored 13 goals in all competitions and 9 in the Premier League. But I don't sense that Newcastle will get Barnes and Madison, if I'm honest, but it's absolutely true that Newcastle have got a historical interest in Harvey Barnes. So let's wait and see whether they progress that. Again, at the time of recording, nobody has approached Leicester. I know that people will say, well, if we're talking about Madison to Leicester, won't we just talk about Harvey Barnes? But believe it or not, when you do those kind of separate deals, you tend to do one first and then the other, rather than necessarily use the conversation to do both at once, because it can just complicate matters. I also think that West Ham are one to watch, and very possibly Aston Villa as well. So Barnes might end up either playing with Madison at Newcastle if that one comes off, or Youri Tielemans at Aston Villa as well. But I wouldn't be discounting West Ham. Barnes is not going to be short of options, because even though Leicester went down, he had a fantastic season. And again, he's another player that's exactly the right profile and age, proven Premier League quality, a goal scorer, versatile, a good dressing room character. So there's a lot to like there for sure. And this, I think, is really interesting. And I'd be quite intrigued from a personal and selfish point of view to see a situation where West Ham, Villa and Newcastle went head to head, because then we'd really see the pull of that Champions League football. Because what Newcastle are being linked with is often an elevation in target. So to some extent, they're still the underdogs. Because if you're João Felix, and you did, not that he does, but if you had an offer from, let's just say, Arsenal, then season on season, you feel like they're going to get European football, and they've got Champions League football, and they're one historically of the Big Six. And then Newcastle enter the conversation, but they don't have as much history or trophies or success in terms of being in the top 4 in recent seasons compared to a club like Arsenal. And that's no disrespect to Newcastle or the football club. It's just the reality. Arsenal have finished higher than Newcastle in recent seasons. So if you want European football season on season, even if that's Europa League football, you go to Arsenal over Newcastle. And this is what I mean about Newcastle entering the conversation and being part of the Big Seven. That's the João Felix example. But with a Harvey Barnes, it's different, because if the suitors are Villa, West Ham and Newcastle, then Aston Villa have got UEFA Europa Conference League football. West Ham, because they won that tournament, have got Europa League football, and Newcastle have got Champions League football. So suddenly you get the benefit of finishing in the top 4 last season, and it might just give Newcastle the edge if they choose to proceed.
South Korean defender Kim Min-jae had been linked with Newcastle, not heavily, it has to be said, but it looks as if he is on his way to Old Trafford when the transfer window opens for a fee in the region of maybe £50 million. That's led to speculation with Newcastle being linked again with another Manchester United player. We've heard a lot about Scott McTominay and discussed it on this show, but we're being linked with Harry Maguire now, and told that potentially he could go for as little as 30 million, but wages could be a stumbling block, Ben.
Yeah, I'm really confused with the centre-back thing, because Kim wants first-team football and to play every week, and he's had a phenomenal season with Napoli. They're still intent on offering him a new deal, by the way. Hasn't been at the club for long, only a season, but Luciano Spalletti's exit might complicate things for some of the Napoli players that might have stayed if Spalletti had remained at Napoli. But now it's a new manager. They've been there, done that, won an incredible Scudetto for the first time in 33 years. Maybe it is time to move to the Premier League. I wouldn't say that's done with Manchester United yet, but the thing about Kim is there's a release clause active in the first 2 weeks of the window. So that means that there's a yardstick valuation out there, whether you trigger the release clause or whether you try and get different payment terms. And that might mean that his future, whether it is staying at Napoli because the release clause goes off the table and they offer him a new deal, or whether someone signs him, that might move quite quickly. I don't think that Newcastle are seriously in the race for Kim. It's not to say they don't like the player, just really, really difficult to get. And I think that Kim would not necessarily want to leave Napoli unless it's for a more established club than Newcastle. And again, that's not about the team, the manager. It's just about him being a bit older and wanting that guarantee of season on season on season of European football. And Newcastle are in for an incredible adventure next season, but then let's see where they finish in the Premier League. There's no guarantees. With Maguire, I don't get it, if I'm honest, because again, and I'm talking from Harry Maguire's perspective, not from Newcastle's perspective. If you're Newcastle United and you can get Harry Maguire, who's a fantastic leader and could be valuable as a squad player, even though I don't think the fan base would be overly excited about that particular move, then at value, why not? And before Maguire's future is decided, there's a conversation this week that's going to take place between Maguire and Ten Hag. And Ten Hag is going to reiterate, from what I'm told, that Maguire is valued on and off the field, but his squad role is diminishing. So it'll be up to Maguire as to whether he wants to leave, especially with England in mind, and get more regular game time. But Newcastle play a back four. There's spots for two centre-backs. You'll have an opinion on this more than me, Steve, but if I take everyone Newcastle have got at the moment and look solely at next season, Maguire is not in my starting 11. So if you're Maguire, surely you've got to leave for a club where you're going to be in the starting 11. I don't see him in the starting 11. So if I'm Maguire, regardless of what Newcastle think, I'm saying, why would I move to Newcastle?
Yeah, it's a strange one. I don't really think there's much mileage in it. I think Newcastle's back four, I think, will be boosted in some way, shape or form, but I think they'll look full backs this season, potentially a good centre-back next season, because, Fabian Schär is getting on, but it's all about strength and depth. They will eventually have, backup in all the positions, but as we know, with financial fair play, we can't do that overnight. Forwards, we'll talk forwards now. Roberto Firmino had a wonderful career and finished at Liverpool now. Again, a lot of people saying, that he would be a good fit for Newcastle. I've got to be honest, I don't see it at this moment in time. I think he'd much prefer a move abroad. I can't see him going to another Premier League club. What's your take on Firmino? It's not been heavily covered. It was a Football Fancast, I think, that put that out there.
Yeah, I don't see it. As you say, if he was going to stay in the Premier League, then he'd have stayed at Liverpool. Simple as that. So I doubt there'll be Premier League as destination. Real Madrid's a possibility, especially now Karim Benzema's gone to Al Ittihad. I know that some think that Real are going to try for Kane. There's obviously the Mbappe story now, and Real might end up moving earlier than they planned for Kylian Mbappe. And Kai Havertz could be on the market. But again, Real are not looking to pay that kind of big money. So Bobby Firmino is a bargain and a budget option. So let's wait and see whether Real move on that. There's interest in Firmino from Turkey. I'm not convinced that will be his next destination. And then the usual suspects, MLS interest, and also from Saudi Arabia as well. So Firmino won't be short of options. But the reason why he doesn't have a club at the moment, which tells you about his character, is that he was adamant he would decide, because Jurgen Klopp wanted to keep him, he would tell Liverpool, and then only after telling Liverpool would he explore his options. So he wasn't talking to clubs. He wasn't lining things up. He wasn't entertaining suitors out of respect to Liverpool. He said, I will decide. Thank you for giving me the time and patience to do so. Liverpool made it clear they wanted to keep him. Firmino made his mind up, completed the season, and really only now is he in the process of finalising or deciding where he's going to go next. And I think that tells you what a fantastic servant he's been to Liverpool. What a great character he is, because he could have very easily had his team line up something for the end of the season so he could have a nice, stable summer, say his goodbye to Liverpool, announce his next move. But it's not happened because he felt the right and proper way to do things was to respect Liverpool, decide if he was going to stay at Liverpool as one separate thing, and then only after that start looking for his next club. But Firmino to Newcastle, Firmino to any Premier League club, I highly, highly doubt, because if Firmino wants to stay in the Premier League, then he would have extended at Liverpool.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. Zaha and Eze, both at Crystal Palace at the moment. Again, very small links with Newcastle United, because, they could be in the market for another forward player. Again, I guess a lot of this depends on who the manager is at Crystal Palace, and length of deals for those respective players as to whether they would even contemplate moving on. I mean, is Roy Hodgson staying? Is he going? We don't know. But, either of those two players, would they be attracted with a move up north to Newcastle, do you think?
I think everyone's attracted to Newcastle because everyone's hearing great things about Newcastle and they've got Champions League football. But with Wilf Zaha, there's lots of options on the table. Let's not forget one of them is Crystal Palace. They're absolutely intent to try increase his wages and get him to sign again. As you say, there's managerial uncertainty as well. And there's an offer on the table from Saudi Arabia, which it looks like Zaha will turn down, but we wait and see until we get full clarification on that. Eberechi Eze, for me, is the more interesting one because I know that Tottenham have looked in the past. There's some links with Liverpool as well. And he just had a magnificent season last campaign, and he's only under contract at Crystal Palace, I think, until 2025. So there's no immediate pressure to sell, but there might be an opportunity to get him at relative value if the right offer is tabled. I'm not aware that Newcastle see either player as a priority at this point, but it's a long, long window.
Yeah. Other names of players who were relegated last season. Jack Harrison at Leeds, somebody who featured, quite heavily in speculation in the last transfer window for Newcastle. He preferred to stay at Leeds and try and keep them up. What's your take on Jack Harrison? There's one or two Leeds players, I guess, that Newcastle United could be interested in.
Yeah, Jack Harrison is a historical Newcastle target, and there was a point where it looked like they might stand a very realistic chance. And we have to wait and see now because Leeds have got new owners and 49ers Enterprises, and we know that Big Sam isn't going to stay either. So it's very similar to Crystal Palace in terms of the turmoil, but even more so because they've dropped down a division. They've already lost Weston McKennie, who's gone back to Juventus, and Leeds had an obligation to buy if they stayed up, but by not staying up, McKennie's gone back, and I think he's very glad because he didn't really enjoy his time at Ellen Road. There is Tyler Adams, who will be sought after. Leeds would absolutely love to have him in the Championship. They feel like he'd be one of the perfect players, but there's going to be outgoings, and Jack Harrison is another one as well who will want to, in an ideal world, play in the Premier League. But I think that the thing about Jack Harrison is that he's had quite a difficult year, really, from when we were in last summer and it looked like he wanted to move, but Leeds wouldn't really sanction it, to then in the last window where it turned out that Leicester actually agreed a deal and Jack Harrison actually went to Leicester's Seagrave training facility to undertake the medical. And before it was done, but I think he'd actually started the medical from what sources told me at the time, Leeds pulled the plug and they U-turned. And then in April, he put a new 5-year deal down. So he's actually contracted until Leeds until 2028. Now, with Jordan Pickford and Everton, for example, there was a kind of a gentleman's agreement that going down would allow still, even with the new contract that Pickford signed, a ability to leave. And I think it will be very similar with Harrison. If the right offer comes in, then Leeds are going to have to entertain it, even though he's contracted until 2028. But there's no guarantees at this point. I think that it's not so much Newcastle looking as a few other clubs. Brighton might be one. And I'm again told Aston Villa, who seem very busy at the moment. It looks like, by the way, Monchi's coming in to Aston Villa as their sporting director from Sevilla. So that's a complicating factor in all of this as well, whether he wants to change the approach. But if we go back a little bit, Villa have looked, Wolves have looked, and Newcastle have looked historically. So I think this is one that might drag out a little bit. And I think that for Harrison, for Madison, for Barnes, for Ward-Prowse, for Lavia, all the kind of relegated talent, there will be several suitors. So even though the clubs have gone down and are in a weaker position, therefore, because they sort of need the money and also they know these players want to leave, the volume of interest should still allow for most of these players, the clubs, to be relatively satisfied with any transfer fee.
Yeah, I would agree. And another relegated player is James Ward-Prowse, of course, at Southampton. again, very good free kick specialists. It's a step up for Newcastle, I think, if they brought James Ward-Prowse in. One would imagine he's going to be a little lower on the list, of priorities. But should they miss out maybe on a Madison or a Dominic Sabrosa, maybe James Ward-Prowse might come into the thinking of Dan Ashworth and Eddie Howe.
Yeah, I mean, James Ward-Prowse, I think, will be a phenomenal signing. I know he's a little bit older than some of the profiles that these clubs are looking at in that position, but he's still only 28, and he's a free kick specialist, like you say, with Premier League experience. So I can see this one having a few surprises because, as you correctly say, if a team misses out on a target, they might turn to James Ward-Prowse. I can tell you that half the Premier League, from what I'm told, have had internal discussions about James Ward-Prowse, which tells you absolutely everything. Newcastle are one of those clubs. Chelsea have had a conversation as well. But as with those two, they're not thinking of Ward-Prowse as the priority, but they're well aware that the fee could be very interesting. I know that we have a couple of more serious approaches on the player side to understand the terms of the deal and whether James Ward-Prowse wants to stay in and around London or down south. West Ham have inquired, but that doesn't mean that they're advancing or they're moving. We're seeing some slightly shock links with Liverpool as well. And I actually think that Everton might be an option for him too. So there's a few clubs looking, and I'm told that Ward-Prowse is expecting to leave, which you would naturally think is logical, given that they're down in the Championship. But he's also looking at his age, very intent now on playing some European football. So that obviously shortens the number of suitors that would be of appeal to James Ward-Prowse. And this is where West Ham winning the UEFA Europa Conference League final might be really important, because it looked like they were battling relegation and wouldn't have anything in terms of European football. And suddenly they've survived and they've got European football. So it's funny how football is just about these tiny marginal gains, because if you'd have asked me 25 weeks into the season, I'd have probably said West Ham could go down. It could be a disaster. They're going to lose Declan Rice. They're going to maybe have to cash in on Scamacca, who hasn't quite worked. Mikel Antonio's getting on a little bit. David Moyes could go, and they got no European football. And now it looks like, and apologies because my camera just fell off.
No worries, mate.
It looks like James Ward-Prowse is going to leave, and West Ham are one of the sort of suitors that are kind of a bit more front of queue, because they've got everything that you would normally have from a great season, but they've actually got it from a very indifferent season, which for those that criticize the Europa Conference League, this is what it's all about. They've had a wonderful moment. David Moyes has got a trophy. They've had something to enjoy and celebrate. And from being stressed all season about the manager situation, about the form of some of their players, they now go into next season on sort of cloud nine. And that's what I love about that tournament. And West Ham are in a much more positive position now, even losing Declan Rice, than they were a few weeks and a few months back. And that's why I think a move for a player like James Ward-Prowse might be something that they seriously look at.
Okay, Ruben Neves, again, linked with a potential move to Newcastle. Thoughts on that one?
I don't think Neves will go to Newcastle. I know that we seem to be running through a lot of targets, and I seem to be implying nobody's going to Newcastle United, although we have spoken very positively about Madison and Szoboszlai as well. And I think there's a few others that have genuine legs, like Kieran Tierney too. So if you're sort of listening and feel like it's a no, then this is just how the window works, to be perfectly honest with you. It's early stages. Every club's got 20 odd names on a list, and you're only ever going to really sign 3 to 5. So 1 in 4 might be genuine and come off, and 3 in 4 might not. And I think that with Ruben Neves, there's a chance of Barcelona, but we keep hearing this, and there's so many moving parts at Barcelona. So we're going to have to wait and see. Wolves realise that they're likely to lose him. I think that Neves will certainly listen to any possibility of an offer from Barcelona before deciding upon his future. But I just don't see Neves wearing a Newcastle United shirt.
Okay, Ferland Mendy from Real Madrid was another one that was linked by the boot room. Again, I just think that is pure speculation. Again, and I don't think he fits the remit for Newcastle. It's certainly not in this window anyway.
Yeah, I mean, people said Newcastle made an offer for Ferland Mendy in January and they didn't, and now people are saying they're on alert again for the same player that they never made an offer for. And I think this, unfortunately, is just the transfer window. And by the way, it's hard to navigate. So we all struggle at times because you're speaking to people directly involved, whether that's the buyer, the seller, the player, or their agent. And if someone directly in the room intimates something, then it can at times be relatively hard to challenge. And this is why you've got to go to all sides. Look at the Mbappe story that broke in the last 24 hours. On the one hand, PSG had a position, but 24 hours later, Mbappe's put out another side. They're both in the room. They were both reading the same letter. One sent it, one received it. So unfortunately, you get a lot of rewriting both at the time and in hindsight. But I don't think that Newcastle have any serious interest in Ferland Mendy at this point. But we again are just going to have to see how things develop, because where you are now in a window isn't where you are in a week or a month's time in a window. Because once Eddie Howe sees pre-season and sees how people gel, or gets in any early signings and then realizes what he's dealing with, or factors in any outgoings, or even, of course, sees how Newcastle United start the season, all of these things can mean that you pivot and move in a different direction. So nothing is really black and white at this point, right in the early stages with the window about to open.
Great stuff, as always. Great insight. Look forward to seeing you again soon, Ben. Take care, mate. Bye-bye.
All the best. Have a good week, everyone.
We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.